David Brennan counted the coins in his leather pouch for the third time that morning. $43 and some change. His entire winter savings. Pathetic as creek water in August, he urged his mare through the muddy streets of Willow Creek, his threadbare coat doing little against the bite of late February wind. And sons. The town square buzzed with the usual Saturday commerce. Farmers hawking root vegetables. Women clustered near the dry goods store. Children darting between wagons. David headed for the feed supplier. His list short and his prospects shorter. Then he saw them. 4 young women stood on a wagon bed in the center of the square. Their dresses were thin, their faces pale with cold. The youngest couldn't have been more than 12, her small hand gripping her older sister's with white-knuckled desperation. Silent tears tracked down her frozen cheeks. A heavy-set man in a good wool coat gestured at them like livestock. The oldest is 19, strong for household work. The second is 17, can cook and sew. These 2 younger ones, well, they'll grow into usefulness. David's hands tightened on his reins. He recognized the man. Luther Hayes, merchant from 2 towns over. Word was his brother had died last year, leaving 4 daughters and debts. I'll take the oldest. A rancher called out, $15. I do the middle one for my son. Another voice offered, $12. Luther Hayes smiled, showing tobacco-stained teeth. Now, gentlemen, let's not separate sisters too quickly, though I suppose if the price is right. The youngest girl made a sound. Half sob, half whimper. The oldest pulled her closer, her jaw set in desperate defiance. Something broke loose in David's chest. A dam he'd built years ago, brick by careful brick, suddenly crumbled. He thought of his own sister, Rachel. Married off at 15 to a man twice her age. He'd been too young then, too poor, too afraid to stop it. He wasn't any of those things now. David dismounted and pushed through the crowd. His boots were worn. His clothes marked him as barely scraping by. But his voice came out steady. I got business here. Luther Hayes turned, sized him up in one dismissive glance. You got business here. Drifter, these girls ain't charity cases. I'm buying. David said. The crowd murmured. Luther's eyebrows rose. You got money for one of them. Maybe. Which one you want? David pulled out his pouch, emptied it into his palm. Every coin he had in the world glinted in the weak winter sun. I'm buying all 4, together. Luther laughed, but his eyes calculated. That's maybe $40. These girls are worth 20 each, at least. They're worth a hell of a lot more than that. David said quietly. But I'm guessing you want them gone quick. Without questions. $43.60. Take it or answer to folks about why you're selling your brother's children like mules. The laughter died. Luther's face darkened. But David saw the flicker of uncertainty. The crowd had gone quiet. Watching. A few women whispered behind their hands. Luther snatched the money from David's palm, counted it quickly, and stuffed it in his pocket. They're yours. Good riddance to bad baggage. He climbed down from the wagon and walked away without looking back. David stood there, suddenly aware of what he'd done. 4 pairs of eyes stared at him. Fear. Confusion. A desperate, fragile hope. Come on down from there, he said, gentler than he'd spoken to anyone in years. Let's go home. The oldest girl moved first, climbing down with careful dignity despite her threadbare dress. She helped the youngest down, then the other two. They stood in a tight cluster, waiting. David led his mare to the wagon, aware of every eye in the square watching. Whispers followed him like winter wind. He heard fragments. Bachelor. Improper. What's he want with 4 young girls? He ignored them all. He'd stopped caring what people thought the day he buried his parents, and watched his sister, married off, to pay their debts. What's your names? He asked, keeping his voice low. The oldest lifted her chin. She had their mother's features probably, delicate but fierce. I'm Margaret Hayes. This is Jane, Beth. And Clara? She indicated each in turn. Jane looked about 17. Beth, maybe 15. Clara, the youngest, hadn't let go of Margaret's hand. I'm David Brennan. I got a ranch about an hour's ride west of here. He gestured to the wagon. It ain't much, but it's better than what was about to happen here. I did Kai. Where are you taking us? Margaret's voice stayed steady, but David heard the tremor underneath. She was 19 and terrified, trying to be brave for the younger ones. To my ranch, he said honestly. I got 1 cabin. It ain't much, but it's yours until we figure better. Why, Jane spoke for the first time. What do you want from us? It was the question he'd expected. The question he deserved. David met her eyes directly. Nothing you ain't willing to give. You need a safe place. I got one. That's all this is. Beth made a small sound of disbelief. Clara just stared at him with huge, hollow eyes. You can believe me or not, David said, but right now, you're coming with me. Later. If you want to leave, I won't stop you. You got my word on that? He helped them into the wagon, aware of how young they were, how thin under their inadequate clothing. Margaret sat in front with him. The other 3 huddled together in the wagon bed, sharing a single blanket David pulled from his supplies. The ride out of town took forever. People stared from doorways and windows. The churchwomen clustered on the corner, their faces tight with judgment. Sheriff Morrison watched from his porch, but didn't move to intervene. David kept his eyes on the road. Once they cleared the town limits, the tension eased slightly. The land opened up, rolling hills still brown with winter but hinting at the green that would come. His ranch sat in a shallow valley, protected from the worst winds by a line of cottonwoods. When the cabin came into view, David felt the weight of shame. 1 room, maybe 20 feet square, a single window, a door that needed replacing, a chimney that smoked on windy days. The barn was in better condition than his home. He pulled the wagon to a stop. The girls stared at the humble building, their faces carefully blank. It's small, David acknowledged, but it's warm and it's got a good roof. You'll take the cabin. I'll sleep in the barn. Margaret turned to him sharply. What do you mean we'll take it? Where will you? Barn's fine for me. David interrupted. Done it before. You 4 need privacy and space more than I need comfort. He helped them down, led them inside. The cabin looked even smaller with 5 people in it. She remained. 1 bed in the corner, a table with 2 chairs, a trunk, a few shelves. His whole life visible in one glance. There's beans and cornmeal in the barrel. He said, Wood stacked outside. I'll bring water from the well. Tomorrow we'll figure out supplies. Clara started crying quietly, her thin shoulders shaking. Beth put an arm around her. Jane stared at the bare walls with something like despair. Only Margaret looked at him directly. Mr. Brennan, We're grateful, but this can't work. 5 people can't live like this. You're right, David agreed. That's why starting tomorrow, we're building 4 more cabins. 1 for each of you. It'll take time, but you'll have your own homes, your own doors you can lock, your own space. White of 4 faces turned to him in shock. You're going to build us houses. Jane's voice cracked on the last word. Yes, ma'am, David said simply. A man's got to build what matters. That first night, David lay in the barn loft on a pile of hay, his coat pulled tight against the cold, through the thin walls. He heard muffled crying. Clara. Probably. Maybe Beth, too. The sound cut through him like barbed wire. He'd done this. Bought 4 traumatized girls with money he needed for seed and supplies. Promised them homes he had no idea how to build. Put them in a 1-room cabin that barely sheltered him. What the hell had he been thinking? But he knew. He'd been thinking of Rachel. His sister had been 15 when their parents died of fever within 3 days of each other. David was 17, old enough to inherit the failing farm, too young to know how to save it. Creditors came like vultures. The farm was sold for debts, leaving them with nothing. A neighboring rancher, 40 years old and twice widowed, had offered to marry Rachel. She'll be cared for. The man had said, better than what you can do for her. Boy, David had stood there, helpless and broken, and watched his sister married off. She'd looked back at him once, her eyes pleading for a rescue that never came. He'd been too young, too poor, too afraid to stop it. She died in childbirth 2 years later. David had carried that weight every day since. 7 years of guilt, of wishing he'd been braver, stronger, willing to sacrifice more. He'd never forgiven himself for standing silent when she needed him to speak. Today, he'd spoken. But speaking was the easy part. Now he had to make good on his promise. David pulled out the stub of a pencil and smoothed the scrap of paper on his knee. By the light of a lantern, he sketched roughly, his cabin in the center. 4 smaller cabins arranged around it in a loose circle, close enough for safety, far enough for privacy. The materials would cost more than he had. The labor would take months, maybe until fall. He'd have to teach the girls to help, which meant feeding them while they learned. His small herd of cattle wouldn't carry them through. It was impossible. Every practical bone in his body told him so. But he thought of Clara's silent tears, Margaret's fierce protectiveness, the way they'd all flinched when Luther Hayes gestured at them. He thought of his sister's eyes as she married a stranger. Some things were more important than practical. As dawn broke gray and cold over the ranch, David climbed down from the loft. He gathered his tools. A saw, a hammer, nails he'd been saving, a measuring rope. The ground was still frozen, but it would thaw. Everything did. Eventually, he stepped outside and walked to the space east of his cabin. Here, he thought. The first cabin would go here, where it would catch morning sun. He pushed a stake into the half-frozen ground, marking one corner. The cabin door opened. Margaret emerged, wrapped in a blanket, her hair loose around her shoulders. She watched him work for a moment. "You meant it," she said. "About the cabins." "Yes, ma'am. We don't have money to pay you back." "Didn't ask for money." She was quiet for a long moment. "Why are you doing this?" David straightened, met her eyes. "I had a sister once, Rachel. When our parents died, I let her be married off to pay debts. She died 2 years later. in a marriage she never wanted. I was too young and too scared to stop it. He drove another stake into the ground. I ain't too young or too scared anymore. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. I'm sorry about your sister. Me too. David marked the third corner. But maybe I can make it right. Not for her. She's past my helping. But for you and your sisters. What if we can't stay? What if the town makes it too hard? David looked at her then. Really looked. 19 years old. Carrying the weight of 3 younger sisters. Trying to be strong enough for all of them. She reminded him so much of Rachel it hurt. Then we'll figure that out when it comes, he said. But until then, we build. And whatever happens, you'll have had a home, a real one. That's got to count for something. Margaret wiped her eyes. What can we do to help? Can you cook breakfast? I'm terrible at it. Not a ghost of a smile crossed her face. I can try. The sun rose higher, burning off some of the morning frost. David worked on marking the cabin foundation while smoke began to rise from his chimney. The smell of cooking bacon drifted out. Thin but present. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Winter fought spring for another 6 weeks. But David worked through it. Margaret and Jane proved surprisingly capable with tools once shown the basics. Holly. Beth tried hard, though her enthusiasm often outpaced her skill. Clara watched from the cabin doorway. Never speaking. Never participating. But always present. By mid-March, the first cabin's frame stood against the sky. Rough and raw, but solid. The sight of it seemed to shift something in all of them. We actually did that, Jane said one evening. Staring at their work, sawdust clung to her dark hair and her hands bore fresh blisters, but her voice held wonder. You did. David confirmed. I just showed you how. The hardest part wasn't the work. It was the town. 3 weeks after he'd brought the girls home, a delegation arrived. 2 churchwomen in their best dresses, faces pinched with concern that didn't reach their eyes. Sheriff Morrison rode with them, looking uncomfortable. David met them in the yard. Margaret, Jane, and Beth worked on the cabin frame behind him. Clara watched from the doorway. Mr. Brennan, the older churchwoman began. We've come to discuss your situation. Ain't a situation, David said mildly. It's my family. Ain't she? Or Chuck Bill. 4 young women living with a bachelor is improper. The second woman said, People are talking. People always talk. Sheriff Morrison shifted in his saddle. David, I got to ask. Those girls hear of their own, Will. Ask them yourself. Margaret set down her hammer and walked over, wiping her hands on her borrowed work shirt. Adi, we're here because Mr. Brennan bought our freedom when our uncle was selling us to strangers. We're here because he's building us homes. If that's improper. Sheriff, then proper ain't worth much. Ave Evie de deste. The first churchwoman's lips thinned. A child. You don't understand what people might think. I understand plenty. Margaret cut her off. I understand we were about to be separated and sold. I understand Mr. Brennan spent everything he had to stop it. I understand he sleeps in a barn so we can have shelter. What I don't understand is why you're here judging instead of helping. The silence that followed was sharp enough to draw blood. Sheriff Morrison cleared his throat. As long as nobody's being harmed or held against their will, I got no cause for concern. He tipped his hat to Margaret. Miss. The church women left with tight smiles and promises to pray for them all. It didn't sound like a blessing. After they'd gone, David found Margaret sitting on a stack of lumber, her hands shaking slightly. You didn't have to do that, he said. Yes, I did. She looked up at him. You stood up for us. Somebody's got to stand up for you. That afternoon, Jane made her first edible biscuit. They were dense and a little burned, but nobody complained. Beth discovered she had a way with David's horse, calming the mare with soft words and gentle hands. Even Clara emerged from the cabin long enough to hand David nails while he worked on the roof framing. Höschen beat Statien. Small things. Tiny shifts. But David felt the ice between them beginning to thaw. By April, 2 cabins had walls and roofs. They were small, 12 by 12 feet each, barely bigger than a garden shed. But they had doors that locked from the inside, windows that let in light, and small stoves for heat. The day Margaret moved into the first completed cabin, she stood in the doorway for a long time, just looking at the small space that was entirely hers. I've never had my own room before, she said quietly. We always shared, even before Mother and Father died. David nodded, understanding more than she said. It's yours, long as you want it. She turned to him, her eyes bright. Thank you doesn't seem like enough, so it's plenty. And that night, for the first time since they'd arrived, there was no crying from any of the cabins. David lay in the barn loft and listened to the silence. It felt like hope. Late spring brought warmth and possibility. The third cabin was framed and half-roofed. David's small herd grazed on new grass. Margaret planted a garden near her cabin, teaching Beth the difference between weeds and seedlings. Jane had taken over the small bookshelf in David's cabin, organizing his few volumes and reading aloud in the evenings. Her voice was clear and strong, bringing stories to life in the lamplight. Even Clara would creep closer to listen, though she never spoke. One evening in May, they all gathered around David's cabin for supper. It had become a ritual cooking together, sharing the meal, lingering afterward as the sun set and the first stars appeared. Tell us about your family, Jane said suddenly. Your sister, Rachel. David stiffened. Margaret shot Jane a warning look, but David shook his head. It's all right. He poked the fire with a stick, watching sparks rise. Rachel was 2 years younger than me. Dark hair like yours. Jane. Stubborn as a mule. She wanted to be a teacher. Used to practice reading to the chickens. Beth smiled at that. Jane leaned forward, listening intently. When our parents died, everything fell apart. The farm was already failing. Creditors came for everything we had. David's voice went flat. A neighbor offered to marry her. 40 years old. Been widowed twice. He said she'd be cared for, that it was better than what I could give her. How old was she? Margaret asked softly. 15. The fire crackled in the silence. Clara had moved closer, her arms wrapped around her knees. I let it happen. David continued. I told myself I had no choice. But the truth is, I was scared. Scared of being responsible, scared of failing, scared of what people would think if I tried to stop it. So I stood there and watched her marry a man she didn't know. You were 17. Margaret said, what could you have done? Something. David looked at each of them. Anything. But I did nothing. And 2 years later, She died having his baby. I wasn't even there. He didn't send word until after the funeral. Jane's eyes glistened with tears. That's why you helped us. I can't fix what happened to Rachel. Can't bring her back or give her the life she deserved. But maybe I can do for you what I didn't do for her. Give you a chance. Keep you safe. Let you choose your own lives. Margaret stood and crossed to him, placing a hand on his shoulder. You think you failed her? But look what you're doing for us. Maybe that's how she lives on. Through your courage now. The words cracked something open in David's chest. He nodded, unable to speak. Our turn, Margaret said. Returning to her seat, she glanced at her sisters, and something unspoken passed between them. Our mother died 3 years ago. Fever. Like your parents. Our father followed 6 months later. He just gave up. Stopped eating. Stopped talking. One morning he didn't wake up. Jane picked up the story. Uncle Luther took us in, but he didn't want us. He had his own family, his own business. We were just mouths to feed, extra hands for his wife to order around. He wasn't cruel at first. Beth added, just cold, like we were furniture he'd inherited and didn't want. Margaret's voice hardened. I tried to keep us together, tried to make ourselves useful enough to keep. But Luther's wife complained. Said we ate too much. Cost too much. That's when Luther started talking about finding us positions. We knew what that meant. Jane said, marriage if we were lucky. Servitude if we weren't. Beth's voice dropped to almost a whisper. I broke my arm 2 years ago. Uncle Luther said it himself. Didn't want to pay the doctor. It healed wrong. That's why I'm clumsy with tools sometimes. David felt rage rise in his throat, hot and bitter. He forced it down. These girls didn't need his anger. They needed his steadiness. Clara had been sitting so still that when she spoke, everyone jumped. I haven't talked since Mama died. Yet her voice was rusty, barely above a whisper. Uncle Luther said I was simple. Said nobody would want a girl who couldn't speak. She looked directly at David. Her young face solemn. But you're different. You don't expect things. You just build. David's throat closed. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Margaret reached over and took Clara's hand. Jane and Beth did the same, forming a chain of sisters. We're family now, Margaret said firmly. Not by blood, maybe, but by choice. That's stronger. David looked at these 4 young women damaged, brave, healing. Yeah, he managed. We're family. In later. As they prepared for bed. Clara appeared at David's cabin door. Mr. Brennan. Call me David. Then she nodded seriously. David. Can you teach me to build? I want to help with the last cabin. Sure thing. Little one. We'll start tomorrow. She turned to leave. Then paused. Thank you. For being different. After she left. David sat by his dying fire for a long time. The 4 cabins around his formed a loose circle. Windows glowing with lamplight. Smoke rose from 4 chimneys, carrying the promise of warmth and safety. He'd been alone so long he'd forgotten what family sounded like. Now he remembered. The storm came in June, sudden and violent like frontier weather often did. Dark clouds rolled in from the west around noon, turning day to twilight. Wind bent the cottonwoods double and sent loose tools flying. Get inside! David shouted over the rising howl. They'd been working on the fourth cabin. Nearly finished now. Margaret and Jane ran for their cabins. Beth grabbed Clara's hand and pulled her towards shelter. David fought to secure what he could. Canvas tarps whipped from his hands. The partially roofed fourth cabin groaned under the wind's assault. Rain came in sheets, cold and driving, soaking him instantly. A crack like a rifle shot. One of the roof supports on the third cabin gave way. Lumber crashing down. David ran toward it, knowing even as he moved that it was too late. The structure they'd spent weeks building collapsed in on itself. Walls buckling. Roof caving inward. Then he heard the sound that stopped his heart. His cattle, bellowing in distress. He ran for the small corral where his herd sheltered. 8 head. His whole livelihood. His only source of income. They were sick. He saw it immediately. 3 were down. Their breathing labored and strange. The others staggered. Foam at their mouths. No. David breathed. God! No. He'd seen this before. Blackleg disease. Swift and deadly. It would take the whole herd in days. The storm raged through the afternoon. By evening, 2 more cattle were down. David worked in the rain, trying to separate the sick from the healthy, knowing it was probably already too late. His hands shook from cold and exhaustion, and the creeping awareness that everything was falling apart. Margaret found him after dark, still working in the rain. David, come inside. You'll catch your death. The herd's dying. His voice came out flat. Without them, I can't pay for supplies. Can't finish the cabins. Can't feed us through winter. We'll figure it out. I know how. He turned to her, rain streaming down his face. I got maybe $15 left. That won't buy seed. Won't repair the damage. Won't cover medicine if anyone gets sick. I took you from one bad situation and brought you to another. Margaret grabbed his shoulders. Stop. We're not going anywhere. The town will help you. The church will place you in separate homes as servants. Exactly what Uncle Luther was doing. Her voice shook with fury. You think we'll let you give up that easy? After everything you've done, I can't provide for you. And we'll provide for ourselves. David stared at her, rain-soaked and defiant, and felt something break inside him. He'd tried so hard to be strong enough for all of them, but he wasn't. He was just one man, and it wasn't enough. 2 days after the storm, the youngest 2 got sick. Fever. Chills. The coughing that came from rain-soaked lungs. Beth first, then Clara. David sat between their beds in Margaret's cabin, watching them shiver under every blanket they owned. The doctor would cost $5. David didn't have $5. Margaret and Jane scraped together what coins they had. $2. 30 cents. Not enough. The general store had stopped extending David credit after the churchwomen's visit. But did Mank Shalmer for? Jane stood in the cabin doorway, her jaw set in that stubborn haze way. I'm going to town. They won't help. David said tiredly. Maybe not. She pulled something from her pocket. A small locket. Tarnished silver. This was Mama's. It's all I have of her, but it's worth something. Jane. No. Yes, she met his eyes. Family protects family. That's what you taught us. She rode to town alone. came back 3 hours later with medicine and no locket. The pharmacist had taken it for $3, less than half what it was worth. Jane's face was calm, but her hands shook when she handed David the bottle. Jane. Don't, she said quietly. Just make them better. The medicine helped. After 2 days, the fevers broke. Beth recovered quickly, young and resilient. Clara took longer, her small body fighting hard. David sat with her through the worst of it, cooling her forehead with damp cloths, holding her hand when nightmares made her cry out. When she finally opened her eyes, clear and aware, she whispered, "You stayed." "Of course I stayed. Uncle Luther didn't." When Beth broke her arm, he left her in the barn, said she'd heal or she wouldn't. "Her stay." David's throat tightened. "I ain't your uncle, and I ain't leaving." But after Clara fell back into healthy sleep, David walked outside and assessed the damage. One cabin destroyed, another damaged. His herd dead or dying. 5 more gone since the storm. The garden trampled by panicked cattle. His tool shed collapsed. He'd failed them, just like he'd failed Rachel. Good intentions weren't enough. Love wasn't enough. A man needed resources, money, power to protect the people he cared for. And David had none of those things. He was still standing there, staring at the ruins. When dawn came, he was considering the unthinkable, sending the girls to the territorial orphanage. They'd be together, at least fed and housed. It would break his heart. But maybe that was the price of doing right by them. He turned toward the cabins to wake them, to tell them his decision. All 4 stood outside Margaret's cabin, dressed for work, tools in hand. They'd been watching him. "We know what you're thinking," Margaret said. "The answer is no." "How you know?" "You don't understand?" "We understand everything." Jane stepped forward. "You're thinking we'd be better off somewhere else. You're thinking you failed us. I can't protect you. Can't even feed you properly." Beth spoke up, her voice clear despite recent illness. "You gave us something more important than food. You gave us dignity, choice, a place to be ourselves." Clara walked up to him and took his hand. "You stayed when I was sick. Now we stay while you're hurting." David looked at these 4 young women he'd tried to save. They stood together, united and determined. And he realized something. He hadn't saved them. They'd saved each other, and now they were trying to save him. "I don't know how to fix this," he admitted. "Then we figure it out together." Margaret said, "That's what family does." David walked his property line that night, unable to sleep. The half moon illuminated the damaged, collapsed structures, dying cattle, trampled garden. Every direction he looked showed his failure. He'd spent $43 saving 4 strangers. Noble. Maybe stupid. Certainly. What had it accomplished? They were all poor together now, facing a winter they might not survive. The old voices in his head whispered, "In try traver each honor." The voices that had told him he was too young to save Rachel, too weak to stand against convention. Maybe those voices had been right. He reached the eastern boundary, marked by an old lightning-struck oak, and sat heavily against it. If he sent them away now, at least they'd be safe. The orphanage wasn't ideal, but it was better than starvation. That's when he saw the light, small and flickering. near the damaged third cabin. More lights appeared, 4 of them, lanterns bobbing in the darkness. He stood, confused, and walked back toward his property center. All 4 girls worked by lantern light, wearing nightgowns with coats thrown over them. Clara held nails in a small bucket. Beth steadied boards. Jane and Margaret hammered, their movements careful and determined. David stopped at the edge of the light, watching. They'd been doing this every night since the storm, while he slept or brooded, repairing what wind and rain had broken. Margaret saw him first. She straightened, hammer in hand. "We couldn't let you face this alone." "You've been every night," Jane confirmed. "We're almost done. Another week, maybe 2, and the third cabin will be livable again." "I can't ask you to do this." "You didn't ask." Beth's young face was fierce in the lamplight. "You gave us freedom, taught us strength. Now we build together. That's what family does." Clara set down her nail bucket and walked to him. "You don't give up on us. We don't give up on you." Something shifted in David's chest. All this time, he'd been trying to be strong enough for everyone, but strength wasn't carrying burdens alone. Strength was accepting help, letting others carry you when you couldn't walk. He picked up a hammer. "Show me what needs doing." They worked until dawn, 5 people building together in the darkness. As the sun rose, the third cabin stood whole again, wounded but standing. Over the following weeks, something changed. David stopped trying to do everything himself. He taught the girls not just carpentry, but ranching, accounting, planning. They weren't just living on his ranch. They were running it together. An old rancher named Tom Garrett rode up one afternoon in July. David knew him vaguely, a man of few words who ran a successful spread north of town. "I heard you had some trouble," Garrett said without preamble. "News travels." "It does." Garrett gestured to his loaded wagon. "Brought some lumber. Call it payment for services to decency." David stared. "I didn't do nothing for you." "You did something for all of us. Reminded us what courage looks like." Garrett tipped his hat. "I figure the least I can do is help you finish what you started." After he left, more came. A widow named Mrs. Chen brought chickens. A young farmer offered credit on seed. The blacksmith appeared one morning and repaired David's broken tools without being asked, then rode away before David could even thank him properly. Not everyone helped. The church women still crossed the street when they saw the girls. Some merchants still refused service. But enough people came through that by August, all 4 cabins stood complete. The day Jane moved into the last finished cabin, they gathered in the common space David had built between the structures. 5 cabins arranged in a protective circle, each with its own hearth. Smoke rose from 5 chimneys into the clear summer sky. "We should name it," Clara said. She'd been talking more lately, her voice gaining confidence. "This place. Our place." "What would you call it?" David asked. Margaret looked around at their small community, at the sisters she'd protected through hell, at the man who'd given them all a second chance, Hope Springs, because that's what grew here when everything else was dry. They built a sign that evening, crude but meaningful, burned the words into a board and planted it at the property entrance. Hope Springs Ranch, population 5. That night, David lay in his cabin, the only one still without a real door, still the smallest and most worn. He didn't mind. Through his window, he could see 4 other cabins, windows glowing with lamplight, 4 hearths burning, 4 young women safe and growing stronger every day. He thought of Rachel, wondered what she'd think of this place, this family he'd built from ashes and stubbornness, and one moment of moral courage. Maybe she'd be proud. Maybe she'd say this was what he was supposed to do all along. Take the fear that had paralyzed him and forge it into something useful. Turn guilt into purpose. David closed his eyes. And for the first time in 7 years, he slept without nightmares. The town meeting was called for the first Saturday in September. David heard about it from Mrs. Chen when he went to buy feed. The subject, the Brennan situation. They're going to try to force something, Mrs. Chen warned. Her weathered face concerned. The church women have been organizing. Sheriff Morrison will be there. David nodded slowly. He'd known this was coming. 6 months of a bachelor living with 4 young women. The talk had never stopped, just shifted underground. You don't have to go, Margaret said that evening when he told them. We can ignore it. Can't ignore it forever. David looked at each of them. 6 months had changed them all. Margaret had grown from frightened guardian to confident young woman. Jane had started teaching reading to children from neighboring ranches. Beth had a gift with horses that was earning them actual income. Clara smiled now, laughed even. Her silence broken. We're going with you, Jane said firmly. It might be ugly. Then we face ugly together. Beth's chin lifted. You faced everything for us. Time we return the favor. They rode into town on Saturday afternoon. The meeting hall was packed. Seemed like half the county had come, whether out of genuine concern or simple curiosity. David couldn't say. The girls wore their Sunday dresses, simple but clean, sewn by their own hands. They walked with heads high, standing close but not cowering. David felt pride surge through him. The church women sat in the front row, their faces set. Sheriff Morrison stood near the door. Looking uncomfortable, Reverend Walsh stood at the front, and beside him, Luther Hayes. David's hands clenched into fists. He hadn't seen the man since that February morning. Reverend Walsh called the meeting to order. We're here to discuss the living arrangements at the Brennan Ranch. Several concerned citizens have questions about propriety and the welfare of 4 young women living within. Unmarried man. We have concerns about their moral education, Mrs. Pritchard said, standing. About what example is being set. Edward de C. Cambridgeo. About whether they're being held there against their will. Another voice added. Sheriff Morrison cleared his throat. I've visited the property. The young ladies seem content and aren't being held against their will. But is it proper? Mrs. Pritchard insisted. A bachelor and 4 girls. We're not girls. Margaret stood, her voice ringing clear. We're young women, and we're here to speak for ourselves. The room went silent. David hadn't planned this, but he should have known. These weren't the terrified sisters he'd bought 6 months ago. Margaret stepped forward. I'm Margaret Hayes, 19 years old. Last February, my uncle, she gestured to Luther, who squirmed, was selling us to strangers. Separate buyers. He cared more about getting $20 each than keeping us together. Jane stood next to her sister. I'm Jane, 17. The man who was buying me wanted a wife for his son. His 16-year-old son who I'd never met. Beth joined them. I'm Beth, 15, and nobody wanted me. Because my uncle let my arm heal wrong after I broke it. I was going to be sold for housework. Clara. Small but determined. Completed the line. I'm Clara. I'm 12. My uncle said I was simple because I didn't talk. He was going to give me away just to be rid of me. The four stood shoulder to shoulder, facing the packed room. David Brennan spent every dollar he had to buy our freedom. Margaret continued. Then he built us homes, 4 separate cabins with doors that lock. He taught us ranching, reading, accounting. He gave us skills and choices. Jane pulled out a ledger. Our ranch is profitable. Beth trains horses. I teach reading. Margaret manages our accounts. We're not charity cases. We're a functioning household. He sleeps in his own cabin. Beth said firmly. We each have our own space. He's never once made us uncomfortable or asked for anything improper. Clara spoke last, her voice quiet but steady. He's not our owner. He's our father. The only real father any of us have known since our parents died. The silence that followed was profound. David saw faces around the room, some skeptical, some thoughtful, some openly moved. Then Reverend Walsh stood. David braced for condemnation, but the Reverend's face was troubled, not angry. I came here to condemn, he said slowly. I believed this situation was improper, possibly dangerous. But I see now I was looking for scandal where there was only compassion. He looked directly at Luther Hayes. We should have done this. The church, the community. We should have helped these girls when their parents died. Instead, we looked away while you sold them like livestock. Luther's face went red. I had a right. You had a responsibility. Reverend Walsh cut him off. One, you failed spectacularly. While you were profiting from their misery, one poor rancher did what all of us should have done. He helped. Tom Garrett stood. I've watched Brennan's place. Seen those girls grow from frightened to confident. Seen them work. Learn. Thrive. Don't know what some of you call that, but I call it family. Mrs. Chen stood next. I call it what our community should have done in the first place. Be ashamed we forced one man to stand alone. One by one. Others stood. Not everyone. The church women remained seated, disapproving, but enough stood that the tide had turned. Sheriff Morrison cleared his throat. An auto di mingstanan bate. Unless anyone has evidence of actual wrongdoing. I see no cause for legal action. These young ladies are clearly here by choice and are well cared for. The meeting dissolved into smaller conversations as they left. Margaret turned to David. We did it. We actually did it. You did it, David corrected. I just stood there. Sometimes that's what family needs most. Someone to stand beside them. They walked outside into the September evening. Clara slipped her hand into David's. Papa, she said clearly, and the word hung in the air like a prayer. David stopped, looked down at this little girl who'd been silent for 2 years, who'd found her voice again. Yeah, little one. Are we really going to be okay now? He looked at all 4 of them. Margaret, Jane, Beth, Clara. His daughters in every way that mattered. Yeah, we're going to be fine. 2 years later, David stood in the center of Hope Springs Ranch and marveled at what had grown. The original 5 cabins had multiplied. 9 structures now, including a small schoolhouse where Jane taught, a workshop where Beth trained horses, and a communal dining hall. They weren't alone anymore. Old Garrett had sent them a widower struggling after his wife's death. Margaret had welcomed him, helped him build a small cabin on the eastern edge. He tended the expanded gardens now, finding purpose in growing things. A young couple fleeing an abusive situation had arrived in spring. They farmed adjacent land, paying rent by working the ranch. The woman was pregnant now, glowing with hope she hadn't had 6 months ago. Mrs. Chen's niece, escaping an arranged marriage, lived in one of the new cabins and helped Jane with teaching. 3 orphaned children from a neighboring county had come just last month, settling into a cabin together under Margaret's gentle supervision. All in all, Hope Springs had become what David never intended: a refuge, not charity, but community. People came broken and left whole, or at least healing. They worked together, supported each other, created family from shared need and mutual care. A territorial official named Mr. Harrison had visited in October, documenting their community structure. He'd spent 3 days interviewing residents, examining their books, observing their routines. "This is remarkable," he'd said to David on his last evening. "You've created a self-sustaining support system. People maintain dignity while receiving help. It's exactly what the territory needs." "I didn't create anything," David had protested. "It just happened." "No." Harrison had looked at him seriously. "You had the courage to act when others looked away. Everything that followed came from that one moment. That's what I'll report. That one person's moral courage can transform a community." Now Harrison was back, bringing news. He found David repairing fence line, Clara working beside him. She was 14 now, taller and confident, her laughter frequent. "Mr. Brennan," Harrison called. "Might we talk?" They sat in the dining hall. Margaret brought coffee. Jane joined them with her ledger. Beth finished with a horse and came in dusty but interested. "Na, I decall. The territorial government wants to establish a system based on your model." "Sifak," Harrison said without preamble. "Refuges throughout the frontier. Places where vulnerable people can find safety, learn skills, rebuild lives. They're calling them Hope Springs houses." David stared. I don't know what to say. Say you'll help us refine the model. Share what works, what doesn't. You've proven this can succeed." "Aye." Harrison spread papers on the table. "These are proposals for 5 new locations. Each would operate independently but follow your core principles: dignity, skill building, community support." Margaret leaned over the documents, her eyes scanning quickly. She'd grown into her role as administrator, managing not just their ranch, but helping neighbors organize their own operations. We'd need to ensure each location has sustainable income, gardens, livestock, trade skills. "That's where you come in," Harrison said. "Training administrators. The governor wants this working within 2 years. Beth spoke up. "What about funding? Combination of territorial grants and community support. Your model shows these places can become self-sufficient within 18 months. They talked for hours, planning and dreaming. By evening, David's head spun with possibilities. What had started with one impulsive act had somehow become institutional change. His failure with Rachel transformed into saving dozens, maybe hundreds. After Harrison left, the extended Hope Springs family gathered for supper. 23 people now filled the dining hall. Children laughed. Adults shared stories. Community breathed and lived. David sat at the head of the table, not because he demanded that position, but because everyone insisted. Margaret sat to his right, managing logistics. Jane to his left, planning next week's lessons. Beth near the door, ready to help with the younger children. Clara beside him, occasionally leaning against his shoulder like she had as a child. After the meal, as people drifted to their cabins, Clara tugged his sleeve. "Come see something." She led him to the property entrance. A new sign stood there, larger than the original. Hope Springs Ranch. It read, underneath, in smaller letters, where courage builds community. "We made it," Clara said. "All of us wanted to mark the place properly." David read it again, throat tight. "It's perfect. Adi Dre, Di Salvadende." "Do you think about her still, your sister Rachel?" "Every day." "Do you think she'd be proud?" David looked around at the lights glowing from multiple cabins, smoke rising from many hearths into the clear November sky. A community built on compassion, sustained by mutual support, expanding still. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I think she would be—" Movement caught his eye. A wagon approached in the dusk, moving slowly. David tensed. Unexpected visitors still made him wary. The wagon stopped. A woman climbed down, young and frightened, pulling 3 small children after her. Bruises marked her face, poorly hidden. The children clung to her skirt, silent and wide-eyed. Margaret appeared at David's shoulder, drawn by some instinct. David. He looked at this woman, these children, saw himself 2 years ago, standing in a town square while injustice happened, saw Rachel in the woman's desperate eyes, saw Clara, Beth, Jane, Margaret in the children's frightened faces. Some things were always clear. Some choices were never really choices at all. He walked forward, kept his movements slow and non-threatening. "Evening, ma'am. You look like you could use a hot meal and a safe place to sleep." The woman's eyes filled with tears. "I heard someone said there was a place, Hope Springs, that people here help." "That's right. I stay." Margaret moved beside David. "We help, and you're welcome here." Clara took the youngest child's hand gently. "Come on, let's get you warm." As they led the new arrivals toward the dining hall, David stood by the sign, "Where courage builds community." He thought of that cold February morning, his leather pouch empty, 4 sisters waiting for salvation. He'd been so afraid then, afraid he'd fail, afraid it wouldn't be enough, afraid of repeating his biggest regret. But courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was acting despite it, building despite uncertainty, standing up even when you weren't sure you could. Margaret returned to his side, another family to shelter, another story to hold. "Yeah, Papa." She rarely used the word, but when she did, it meant something. "Thank you for everything you built. Not just the cabins, but this." She gestured at the thriving community. You saved more than 4 girls that day. You saved the idea that one person can make a difference." David pulled her close. This daughter of his heart. "We saved it together, all of us." The evening star appeared in the darkening sky. David stood with his eldest daughter, watching his family blood and chosen, expanding, always gather in the light and warmth they'd built together. Ardesfa. Home wasn't about walls. He'd learned. It wasn't about blood, or law, or convention. Home was about the courage to build shelter for those who couldn't, and the grace to accept help when you couldn't stand alone. This was home. These people were family. and the work of building, of healing, of hoping that work never ended. It just expanded, circle by circle, hearth by hearth, until the whole frontier glowed with the light of communities built on compassion. Where Ha Namanda, David Brennan had spent $43 on 4 sisters. In return, he'd gotten everything that mattered: purpose, family, legacy, and the certain knowledge that Rachel would have approved.